Welcome to World History. This is Chapter 5. We'll be looking at the Roman Empire. In Chapter 4, we looked at the prehistory of the Roman civilization, as well as the earliest of the two Roman historical periods, the Roman monarchy, running from 753 BC until about 509 BC, and then the second period of Roman history, the Roman Republic, running from 509 BC to about 31 BC or 27 BC, depending on what point you want to end that. And that'll come to a conclusion with the beginning of the rule of Octavian or Augustus Caesar, which will begin the Roman Empire. This next slide here is a time lapse of Roman history from the time of the monarchy around 59, 510 BC until 530 AD. So this is about 1,000 years of history. This will take us through about 60, 70 or so years after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. And we'll end up with just the Byzantine Empire, which will last up until about the 15th century in some form or another. So basically another 1,000 years of history on the east side. But the Roman civilization or Roman Empire in the West will collapse around 476 AD. And we'll be looking at that towards the end of this chapter. So I'm going to hit this time lapse. What you're going to see, it's going to go pretty quick, so I need to narrate this a little bit ahead of time. You'll see about 510 here, the Latins, or those tribes living in the hill country of the Tiber River, will consolidate their power along the Tiber and amongst the hills of Rome, and begin to consolidate a power throughout the Italian peninsula, eventually dominating the Etruscans, the Umbrians, the Samnites, the Greek colonies, and even the Carthaginian colonies that are in the Italian peninsula. And then they will turn their attention to control of the western portion of the Mediterranean, which has been dominated at this point by the Carthaginians based out of Carthage in North Africa. We'll have 100 years or so of three different Punic Wars, which will result in Rome controlling the western portion of the Mediterranean. At that point, they'll turn their attention to the east and begin dominating the territories controlled by the former generals and their descendants of Alexander the Great, whose empire was divided at his death in 323 BC. And so the Antigonids in Macedonia, the Seleucids in Syria and the Middle East, Mesopotamia, and the Ptolemies in Egypt will all eventually, within the next 100 or so years, come under control of the Roman Empire. So let me go ahead and hit this and begin initiating this. Here we can see we're controlling the central part of the Italian peninsula, eventually controlling all of it, turning our attention to the west, eventually coming in conflict with the Carthaginian Empire. Now we're turning east, taking control of the entire Mediterranean world. This is the time of expansion during the Pax Romana. And then we're going to see the division of the Roman Empire into an east and west portion here with Diocletian at the end of the 4th century. Eventually, the empire in the west will collapse, leaving just, as I said earlier, the east, or the Byzantine Empire. So that's what we have to look forward to as we begin this study. So let's look at the first character, the person you need to know as we move into the Roman Empire, Augustus. This is the adopted son of Julius Caesar. He was a nephew of Julius Caesar, but he became the adopted son. And as an adult, he was an adopted son because Julius Caesar didn't have an heir, and it was customary to to adopt somebody if you did not have a male heir. And so he adopted Augustus, or his name was at the time Octavian, and his title will become Augustus later on. But Octavian will become his next heir, and we looked at all the things that were in the intrigue that happened that resulted in Augustus coming to power at the end of the 1st century, and that was last chapter. You can go back and review that. But he's going to rule from 27 BC until 14 AD as the emperor of Rome. Here is a map, as you can see, the Roman Empire at the beginning of his reign, the 1st century BC. And you can see the entire Mediterranean world. It's all purple there. That's all Rome. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to look at this timeline here so you can get a sense of what that looks like here. There we go. There is the timeline for the Roman civilization. There's the prehistory, the three eras of the main Roman timeline: monarchy, republic, and empire. And what we're currently going to be looking at is the empire. And you can see there's Augustus Caesar on the left. You'll see a series of additional Caesars: Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, all very infamous in their own rights. Some major historical events that will take place during this time. The life and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth will take place during this time period, as well as the birth of the New Testament church, the persecution of both Peter and Paul, the martyrdom of Peter and Paul in the early church. Rome will burn, 2/3 of Rome will burn in 64 AD under the time frame of Nero. We're going to see the first of two Jewish revolts, well, really three, but two big Jewish revolts during the time of Nero from 66 to 70 AD. The destruction of the Jewish temple. The famous destruction of Pompeii with the eruption of Mount Vesuvius will happen in 79 AD. A second revolt will happen under Hadrian there in about 132 to 135. The famous philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius from 161 to 180 AD. This is all during what we call the Pax Romana, the first 200 years of Roman history, running from Augustus to Marcus Aurelius, a time of expansion and peace and prosperity for the Roman Empire. That'll move us into a very significant time period called the Imperial Crisis of the 3rd century. We're going to have about, we'll look at this in more detail in a little bit, but it's a significant crisis period. And then we'll have Diocletian, where the empire gets split into east and west for better control and administration. And then the significant persecutions of Christians at the beginning of the 4th century, followed by the leadership and emperorship of Constantine and the Edict of Milan, which will make Christianity a legal religion. Rome will be sacked in 410 AD. This is near the end. And of course, in 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire collapses, and the Eastern Roman Empire becomes the Byzantine Empire, and that will continue for about another 1,000 years till 1473 AD. So that's our basic timeline for the Roman Empire. Let's go back to our slideshow here. So again, 1st century AD, you can see Roman Empire is in control of the entire Mediterranean world. There's Augustus Caesar. The guy is a make it all happen. Of course, a little quick reminder, the Battle of Actium with Mark Antony and Cleopatra resulted in a victory for Augustus. This is how he got control of the Roman Empire. They, of course, will commit suicide and leave control of the empire to Augustus. He will basically take over a lot of responsibilities and authority. The Senate will no longer have the supreme authority and power that it had during the Republic. Augustus will essentially become, or I should say Octavian, that's his name at this point. He hasn't taken the title yet, Augustus, quite yet, but he will become really the hardcore ruler of the Roman Empire. The Senate still has a lot of influence and a lot of power, but it must yield to the authority of the emperor. This is going to institute a 200-year time period of peace and prosperity underneath the reign of Augustus. At least it'll start under him. It'll run for about 200 years. This is called the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace, that generally speaking, within the borders of Rome and the greater Roman territory, there is essentially peace. Now, there are wars that are taking place in the outer frontiers in Gaul and Syria and outer areas, but for the most part, across the Roman Empire that you see here on this map, that there's a general peace that allows for a significant economic growth of the Roman Empire, a lot of prosperity, a lot of wealth being generated. So here we go, Roman prosperity and peace there. If we pull that up there, there we go. It runs from about 31 BC to 180 AD, prosperity and peace throughout the Roman Empire. And as a result of this, we're going to see a lot of imports. Ivory from Africa. You're going to see gold from Africa, silver from Spain. You're going to see silks coming in from the Far East. You're going to see spices coming from Central Asia and the Middle East. You're going to see wheat being imported. Oh, forgot the jewels. A lot of jewels and precious minerals coming from the Far East and the Middle East, Central Asia, and wheat coming from Egypt, which Egypt will be basically the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. A lot of reliance out of Egypt for their grain production along the Nile River Valley. So this is all happening during the Pax Romana. Now, this is a wonderful statue of Octavian. It's a very famous statue. Most people think statues look like this, just marble. But the truth is, This is what they actually looked like. This is a restoration of this statue. And Julius Caesar, Octavian, he'll take the family name as Caesar. This will eventually become a title for him and all succeeding emperors. They'll take the name Caesar as a title, but it's really a family name. But I love this statue that's been redone here, restored, so you can see what these statues would have looked like in the original time. Beautiful color, a lot of detail, not just plain stark white marble. It's quite beautiful. Other titles that you'll need to be familiar with for Octavian, again, Caesar as a family name will eventually become a title for everybody, all succeeding emperors. He'll also have the name of Princeps, which means first citizen. He is the chief citizen of the Roman Empire. And then he's going to have the title Dei Filius, or Son of God. We'll talk more about emperor worship a little bit later. He's also going to take the title, of course, the one he's most famous for is Imperator. This means emperor, general, or ruler. And then probably second most famous, or maybe this is even more famous, is Augustus. And this basically means one who is worthy of honor. Somebody's worthy of majesty. He is sacred. And so this is one of his greatest titles, Augustus. So he was known as Caesar, Imperator, Princeps, Dei Filius, as well as Augustus. These are all names for Octavian. All right. Now, during the Pax Romana, one of the things that Rome is going to be significant at is building roads throughout the Roman Empire. And and it's really hard to estimate how significant and crucial these roads were. They were used for communication, the movement of armies and troops, trade, and postal system. These were all significant, but the primary purpose of the roads was to move the armies from one part of the empire quickly to another so they could put down revolts and any kind of military incursion into their territories. But of course, the secondary benefits would again be commercial and the ability for communication across provinces of the Roman Empire. Thousands and thousands of Roman roads were built during this time period. Some of them are still in existence today, and most of them are at the very least the foundation or basis of the roadway systems that are used today throughout North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. And so another significant thing that happens here during the Pax Romana is there's a lot of piracy going on in the Mediterranean Sea. And Augustus set about to making the Mediterranean Sea safe for commerce, the movement of goods and services across the Mediterranean. And so he wiped out piracy in the Mediterranean. And you can see there, that was our Johnny Depp pirate there. I'm not sure that was the same pirate, but you get the idea. He made traveling not only on the road safe, but traveling across the Mediterranean Sea safe. Now, during his time period, he is going to institute legal reforms, political reforms, as well as many social reforms. Augustus is basically going to be the self-proclaimed restorer of the Roman Republic. He wants to restore Rome's pride and faith, as well as Rome's moral standards, that after 100 years of civil war and difficult times, a lot of internal corruption going on, Augustus wanted to restore Rome to, quote, the good old days. Now, some of the religious forms he's going to institute, he's going to reinstitute some religious celebrations, festivals, and rites that have sort of fallen by the wayside. He wants to promote and encourage traditional Roman religious values, ideas. He will be appointed as Pontifex Maximus, as the high priest. He will, with this title, effectively not only be the head of the state as emperor or imperator, but as Pontifex Maximus, the highest, greatest priest, he will be the head of the cultic religious system. And eventually, they will adopt an Eastern religious system known as the deification of the emperor, or emperor worship, and he will basically become a god himself. This will set a standard for Roman Caesars or emperors to come. Now, he's going to restore many public monuments. He's going to have some moral reforms. He really believed in family, that the strength of Rome, and we said this last chapter, that the center of Roman society was the family, and he really felt like the family had really, over the last 100 years or so, things had sort of fallen off. The wheels had fallen off the wagon. So he encouraged family and proper marriage. He wanted to encourage large families and actually financially rewarded families that had 3 or more children, especially if they were sons. And if you were a single guy over the age of 38, you had a special tax that was put on you because you were not married and were not producing children for Rome. You also were disallowed from receiving inheritance from your parents, and you were not allowed to attend public games. So this was quite a sort of a social banishment as well as a financial loss for men who were 38 years old and single. The Lex Julia de Martendandus Ortinibus is laws that were set up to prohibit celibacy and childless marriages. He really wanted people producing children in marriage, and it's going to ban eventually singleness altogether. Divorce laws will become more strict. Adultery will become not just a personal matter, but a civil crime punishable by death or banishment. And then he's going to create laws eventually that make marriage outside of one's class very, very difficult. So he's really trying to create social reforms, political reforms, and legal reforms that will strengthen the Roman Empire, the state of Rome. Really going to desire that Romans look at being virtuous Romans, hard work, duty, discipline, virtues that were all important to the Roman society. You can see these women are working, these men are working, they're being diligent in how they interact with others. These are some classical paintings that I wanted to show you. You can see this woman is running her family diligently. She's taking care of the family. The home is well kept. This is all not just sitting around idly gossiping, which honestly became a pastime amongst the aristocratic women of the time, which maybe not unlike today's society as well. But Augustus Caesar saw, and the Romans saw, that the highest virtues and duties of a woman was to have a family, to be in control of her family, raising her family, and taking care of her household, and the husband, the pater familias, taking care of it all. So we're going to look at some significant monumental architecture that you should be familiar with in the Roman Empire. Of course, the Roman Forum is going to be full, the center of Rome here, full of great architecture. You're going to see public buildings, very large buildings used for collecting taxes and bureaucratic records. You'll see temples to different deities. Of course, you're going to see theaters. There's a wonderful theater here, very well preserved. This, of course, is an amphitheater, the Flavian Amphitheater. We know it as the Colosseum. Many, many aqueducts for bringing water into the major cities. This is, of course, the Pantheon you may be familiar with in Rome. Triumphant arches, which is what armies would march through on their way to their victory lap around the Hippodrome or the Circus Maximus, which had chariot races as well as horse races. And of course that was baths. Public baths were very important in Roman society, and these monumental architectures were public buildings built with public money, but also often private money from emperors and other important political figures. Now, as we go through the Pax Romana, there's going to be a whole litany of emperors: Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Galba, Aulus, Vitellius, Vespasian, Titus, Domitian, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, as well as Marcus Aurelius. Most of these emperors will be corrupt, self-indulgent, and hedonistic, really about self-promotion and providing an exorbitant, luxurious lifestyle for themselves while essentially running the empire into the ground. Some notable characters in there are a little bit different, but many of them are going to demonstrate some pretty corrupt lifestyles and characters. And again, Rome at its greatest extent here under the rule of Trajan, who reigns from 98 to 117 AD. And you can see all the way through Spain, Gaul, Germany, up through Britain, west through Mesopotamia, and most of North Africa and Egypt. So, and of course, Southeast Europe as well. So significant expansion during this Pax Romana, a lot of wealth and financial and territory gain during this time period. Now, couple of quick things. Roman gods, the Romani Dei. Of course, you can't study Rome without at least mentioning the pantheon of gods, borrowed in a great deal from the Greeks. But you can see many of these names that you recognize. Jupiter, of course, is the counterpart to the Greek Zeus. You've got Juno, his queen, Diane, Neptune, Ceres, Pluto, Vesta, Minerva, Mars, Venus, Apollo, Bacchus, Vulcan, and Mercury. These are the chief deities of Olympus. and the chief deities of the Roman Empire. Now, as I mentioned earlier, an addition during this time period is not just the worship of these gods, but actually emperor worship. That's, again, going to come from the east. That's going to be significant. And if you didn't worship the emperor, this is a problem. And this, of course, set us up for conflict with the Christian faith and the Roman Empire. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes. So a couple of Greek philosophers are going to be very influential in Roman thought, and we'll introduce you to a couple of these. First one is Epicureanism. It's a hard word to say, but Epicurus was a Greek philosopher during the 3rd and 4th century BC, and essentially they said that Epicureanism said that happiness comes as one frees his mind from fear and his body from pain. There's no afterlife, no divine judgment, and essentially that the greatest good that you can do in life is to live your life well, that's pleasing, and don't really worry about an afterlife. This was actually intended to restore, believe it or not, Rome's moral standards. But many, as you can imagine, take these teachings to teach that the only good is to seek happiness, and thus basically you could live a hedonistic lifestyle and do whatever you want because there's no fear of an afterlife. And so this was a very influential philosophy during the Roman Empire. Another one is going to be Stoicism. The highest good is the pursuit of the virtues of courage, dignity, duty, simplicity of life, and service to fellow man. Zeno, a Greek philosopher, again about the same time as Epicurus. But he basically believed that proper living will bring one into harmony with the divine law that guides the universe and directs fates. So this was a very influential competing philosophy, competing against Epicureanism. And then Marcus Aurelius, I need to mention, he was known as the philosopher emperor, and he was very much a Stoic, did a lot of writing about Stoicism as well. And then lastly, of course, as we mentioned a minute ago, emperor worship. This is the idea imported from the East that the emperor was worthy of worship, and he was the greatest priest, the Pontifex Maximus. Emperor became the highest priest and interpreted the will of the gods. So he was the conduit between the gods and the people, and it was important that he be worshipped as well. This will be a significant shift in the type of worship that happens in Rome. Emperor becomes the focus of worship, and loyalty to the state of Rome was expressed by acknowledging the emperor not only as king but also as a god. And as I mentioned a minute ago, you're going to see how this is going to be problematic for believers of Christ being the one true God. Now, some significant events that happened during this Pax Romana that you'll want to be familiar with. Rome, as I mentioned on the timeline, is going to burn in 64 AD. A significant portion of Rome, 2/3 of it actually, is going to go up in flames. That is a lot of the city. In 9 days, it's completely burned down. Nero is actually going to use Christians as a scapegoat and blame them. And there is a succeeding rumor that's going to take place, that Nero actually started the fire in order to clear space in central Rome for his new Domus Aurelius, or his golden palace that he was going to build, which he did build, or at least got a lot of it built after the city recovered. But Christians were persecuted in Rome as a result of this, as they were believed to have been the reason why this fire had taken place. Another major event that happens during this time period, of course, is the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which is going to destroy the city of Pompeii, basically left untouched for about 1,700 years, 1,800 years, before archaeologists eventually start coming in and excavating this site. But thousands of people perished in the eruption, not only of Pompeii, but a smaller town on the other side of the volcano called Herculaneum. But they were both destroyed, lots of loss of life. It was a terrible, terrible destruction. Let's look at this map. You can zoom in. You can see the Italian peninsula. There's Rome in the middle and Pompeii way down there. We're going to zoom in it here on this left map here, and you can see there's Pompeii, and then to the north, this is all on the Bay of Naples here, but you can see Vesuvius and Herculaneum, which is actually closer to Vesuvius than Pompeii is. But because of the direction that the wind is blowing, it's Herculaneum and Pompeii that are destroyed, not Neapolis, which is modern-day Naples. But this is a significant loss here in 79 AD. The city was vast. Archaeologists have done an amazing job recovering much of the city. It laid untouched. Basically, thousands and tens of thousands of pounds, feet, dozens of feet of pumice, rock, lava basically covered, an ash covered the city and left it entombed until archaeologists came along in the 17, 18, 1900s, have excavated. They're still excavating today, and just amazing things that have been found as we can basically reconstruct Roman life from the first century. You can see this beautiful home here. This is called a fresco. This is when you paint in wet plaster, and this is how homes were decorated in Roman society. And they're just absolutely beautiful, vibrant colors. And this is restored from what you can see, the beautiful mosaic tile floors, by the way. This is what archaeologists have found. This is basically a diner, a fast food place here. You can see the beautiful yellow mosaics, the paintings of the chickens, and I don't know if that's a wolf or horse. I'm not sure what that is on the far right. But this was a bakery. Now, some of these next pictures are a little bit more gruesome, but I think it's helpful to paint a picture of the death and destruction that happened here. When the bodies were covered, eventually the bodies, being organic matter, decayed and left a void where the bodies had been. And then the outer tomb of pumice, ash, lava, stone, etc. stayed in place, leaving a void where the body had been. Archaeologists figured this out and early on pumped it full, these voids, with concrete and plaster, and then removed the dirt from the outside and could basically discover the bodies and what positions they were in when they perished. They have modified their techniques and use a much better material. Some of the early plaster was quite crude, but nonetheless, you will be able to see facial expressions from these individuals, and it's quite sad. You can see here two individuals who perished laying down. You can see their facial expressions. You can see this individual here who was basically curled up in a ball here, leaning up against the wall probably. Here was a man sort of trying to crawl away. These are all remains of individuals from Pompeii, and sadly even pets and animals died. Here's a dog who obviously was inhaling toxic fumes and was quite distressed at this time, and then a horse or a donkey, I guess that's probably a horse, that perished as well. A lot of loss of life at this eruption of the Mount Vesuvius at 79 AD. So let's go to the next section here. Let's talk about Rome and Christianity. These two will collide in the first century AD. This will be birthed in the province of Judea. This is the birthplace of Christianity in the first century. It's in the southeast corner of the map there near Egypt. Let's zoom in on that. There's the province of Judea and the city of Jerusalem, which will be where most of the story of the New Testament, that and in the Galilean region and in the Sea of Galilee up north, will take place. Jesus of Nazareth will be an itinerant preacher, preaching about the coming of the kingdom of God in the province of Judea in the first century. He will eventually be crucified during the time of Tiberius Caesar, but under the hand of Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea. And he will be crucified, and as Christians believe, we believe that he was resurrected after 3 days. And it is from this that the birth of the New Testament church will take place and the growth of Christianity. Now in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, it says this: "But when the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship." Now that phrase, "when the time had fully come," is an interesting phrase. Why did Jesus come now? Why did he come then at the first century? Why not hundreds of years earlier? Why not later? Why not today? And the truth is, this was the best time. This was the time that God had begun setting things in motion for the greatest opportunity for mankind to find redemption in God. And so what we find is that God prepared the world and then sent his Son in the perfect time for man's salvation. And it was during this time period, during the Pax Romana, in which there's going to be peace and prosperity, safe travel throughout the empire. Roman roads, as we mentioned, will be built, roads which will allow efficient and safe travel. At this time period, there's going to be a universal language, not Latin, but the Greek language. This is a legacy from Alexander the Great and his spread of Greek culture. But this will be the language of the international commerce and academia. And even the Hebrew scriptures in the 3rd century BC will be translated into Greek. This is called the Septuagint, abbreviated or symbolized with the LXX, Roman numeral 70. And so the Greek language will allow for communication easily of the gospel message. In addition to that, we have something called the diaspora, or the dispersion of the Jews throughout the East and Europe. This happened way back. We talked about the spread of Jews and the Hebrews during the time of the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire. Back in the 8th and 6th centuries BC, Jews were spread out. Eventually, many of them returned to Judea, but many families stayed dispersed in those territories. And since that time period, Jews have moved throughout the Roman Empire, throughout Rome, Gaul, Spain, Asia Minor, Africa, Egypt, and so Jews are really all over the world. And so the fact that there's this dispersion of Jews is going to be important, because the Jews will set up synagogues throughout the empire, wherever they're residing. If there were 10 or more Jewish males, you could establish a synagogue, and this is going to be important. Let's look at Matthew 28:19-20. It says, Jesus, one of his last commands says, "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I commanded you." Jesus essentially gave his earliest followers the command to go out and share the good news of Jesus, about his life, death, resurrection, and his accomplishment of being able to provide forgiveness of sin and a restoration to a relationship with God. This is good news, the evangelion, or the euangelion, the good news. And so they spread the word. That was the book of Acts is all about that. There was a missionary zeal to carry out this great commission, and it's going to collide with the Pax Romana and the diaspora, providing the New Testament church with immediate growth. The Pax Romana and the diaspora provided the following to Paul and the early apostles. Number one is going to be a place to preach about the Messiah. As I said, synagogues were spread throughout the empire, wherever there was a Jewish populace of 10 or more Jewish males. And so there was a ready-made audience that was already seeking and awaiting the long-promised Messiah, the one who would help restore Israel. And so wherever Paul went, or the early apostles went, they had a ready-made audience waiting for them to hear about the Messiah. And of course, Paul had, and the early apostles had the good news about the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. In addition to that, like I said, a Jewish audience waiting to hear about the Messiah. So not only they had places, but they had an audience waiting. Then there was, of course, as I said, the universal language Greek that they could all understand. No matter where Paul and the early apostles went, they could communicate easily with their audience because many or most knew Greek. And because of the Pax Romana, there was an open borders and free travel across the Roman Empire. It was not relegated to just a small territory. Throughout the empire, they could easily and freely travel. And of course, these Roman roads gave them easy access to these provinces and, again, safety in travel. Now, early Christian churches are going to be established during this first century. The church is going to be led by apostles. And after the death of the apostles, individual churches are going to select men of wisdom and experience. These will be called pastors or shepherds, sometimes bishops, and they will help lead and guide the church and keep them from doctrinal error, especially during times of persecution. And as these churches grew, the office of pastor, bishop grew in prestige and influence, and that can be a good and bad thing. We'll see here at times it's one and sometimes the other. Individual churches and their pastors or bishops become more influential than others, especially if that church had been founded by an apostle and if that church had started many daughter churches or secondary churches as they grew. And if that church was located in a city of political or economic importance, then that church and that bishop would become very influential. And at times that's going to be a good thing, and sometimes that will end up being not a good thing. We'll look at that a little bit more closely here in a minute. Now, Roman emperors at different times and leaders will begin persecuting Christians. And here's some of the list of the reasons why. Number one, they didn't burn incense at the altars of the emperors. That says that you weren't loyal to the state of Rome. They would not recognize emperors as Lord or gods. They would not worship the emperors. They rejected the pagan deities of Rome, the traditional deities. They didn't participate in pagan festivals and rituals. They didn't participate in typical Roman vices. They didn't work on Sundays. They met, quote, in secret. Were they planning revolts? They were also considered cannibals because they heard stories of them eating the body and drinking the blood of Jesus, their leader. Christianity claimed exclusive claim of truth and salvation through Jesus. The Romans resented the missionary spirit of Christians, the fact that they wanted to share this with other people. This was all seen as a threat to the Roman way of life. And as I mentioned earlier, Nero will begin blaming Christians for the burning of Rome. That will start a localized emperor persecution of Christians, but that will grow later into empire-wide. Eventually, the Romans will begin to blame the Christians for the destruction of Pompeii with the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. They assumed that the gods were mad at the Romans for allowing Christianity to spread, and this again will put Rome in conflict with Christianity. Now, I want you to understand there's two kinds of persecution. First, there's the local persecution, very localized. This was not always empire-wide. Persecution began when because Christianity was believed to oppose Roman values. This will take two forms. Again, local. This is not systematic oppression of all Christians. That will come. But at this level, it's just a local thing. Local officials, whether Jewish or Roman, will take it upon themselves to persecute Christians because it was perceived that Christians were causing economic or political problems. And Emperor Nero, as I said, after the first fire or the fire of Rome, will begin imperial persecution of Christians, but it's only local to Rome. He doesn't send word out to persecute Christians everywhere. It's just a local thing in Rome. He will have them tortured. They will be torn apart by wild animals. You've probably seen reference to this in some gladiatorial combats, and they will be put in there to fight each other people, or animals. Many will be crucified, and many will be burned alive on stakes. Basically oil poured on them and then lit up as nightlights for Roman roads. It was a horrible, tragic thing. Many Christians lost their lives, men and women and children. From Nero up until about 250 AD, this is the kind of persecution that Christians endured, local and sporadic. However, there will be times that there will be empire-wide persecution, not just local, but throughout the Roman Empire. This is official. This is systematic oppression, and it was designed to exterminate Christianity. In 250 AD, persecution becomes an empire-wide systematic policy. Diocletian is probably going to be the one who's most famous for this, and he is the last emperor to officially persecute Christians. From 284 to 305 AD is when Diocletian ruled. He will issue decrees that outlaw Christianity. He will torture and execute Christians, destroy churches and Bibles. He's basically hoping to get Christians to renounce their faith and prevent others from becoming Christians. And so this is a very difficult time for Christians during the latter part of the Roman Empire. Now, let's look at the latter part. We looked at the earlier part, the Pax Romana, from about 31 BC to 180 AD. Well, what happens in the second part of the Roman Empire from 180 to 476? Well, the first major event we're going to look at is the Imperial Crisis from 235 to 284. This is a time of significant infighting, significant political intrigue during the 3rd century. And it's going to basically be the near collapse of the Roman Empire, which there are going to be 26 emperors during a span of 50 years. 26 emperors during a span of 50 years. There's going to be civil war, plague, economic depression, all kinds of things are happening here that make the Roman Empire incredibly weak, and it nearly collapses. As a matter of fact, during this time period, it's actually going to divide into 3 different states. You can see this map here, see what this looks like. Oh, here's a list of the names. There's the Palmyrene Empire, the Gallic Empire, and then the Roman Empire. We'll see what these territories look like on this map here. Here we go. So you can see the Roman section, the main section is most of Rome, Southeast Europe, part of Anatolia, and North Africa. The Gallic Empire is Gaul, Spain, and Britain. There will be times that Spain will be under the control of Rome. That's why it's got the purple lines there. So sometimes it's part of Rome, sometimes it's part of Gaul. And then the Far East, the Palmyrean Empire, is Syria, Mesopotamia, Israel, Judea, and Egypt. And so during this crisis, the empire is quite divided. Again, 26 emperors over the course of 50 years. It's not good. Now, the crisis is going to get contained with a guy by the name of Diocletian. I mentioned him a minute ago. He's going to reign from 284 to 305. And quite frankly, he is going to be the reason why this 3rd century imperial crisis will come to an end. He's going to have an autocratic rule with an iron fist. He's trying to do everything he can to reform some things that need to strengthen the empire to make it continue. And he will basically impose uniform imperial values that have to be done throughout the Roman Empire. He will divide the empire into a Tetraarchy, or a 4-man rule. His reforms are essentially going to be a good thing in many regards from a political standpoint. He's going to reform the empire and strengthen it, allowing it to continue for another 200 years in the West and another 1,200 years in the East for the Byzantine Empire. So from a political state perspective, he did some great things. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, one of the things he tried to do to unify and strengthen the empire was to significantly and horrendously persecute Christians. So that, of course, was a terrible, terrible thing. Here's a map that shows how he divided the empire. There's going to be the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. And Rome, the capital, will shift from Rome to it's going to shift to Milan. You can see the capital there from 285 to 402. And then after 402 to 476, the final capital for that last 100 or so years, or 75 years, is going to be in Ravenna. Rome will continue to be the spiritual and even the symbolic capital of the Western Empire, but it is not the political capital. And then in the East, Constantinople will become the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. So what does this Tetrarchy mean? Well, tetra means 4, and arch means rule. So it's a 4-man rule. And what we're going to have is both in the West and the East, there will be an Augustus and there will be a Caesar. So the top ruler for each of them will be Augustus. And there's essentially a junior emperor in waiting, maybe consider like a vice president, so to speak, a Caesar. And so that when the Augustus passed away, the Caesar then would become the new Augustus and a new Caesar would be appointed. So the idea is that there would always be a leader waiting, trained, and everybody knew who that would be. There was a line of succession. Unfortunately, for the last 100 or so years, the idea of a son following his father in line had basically devolved. That's why we had the 3rd century crisis, that when an emperor died, nobody knew who was the king or the emperor, and you had generals that would basically fight it out, slug it out to decide who was going to become the next emperor. And it just was not a great way of having succeeding leadership. So Diocletian considered this to be a good one. 2 emperors, the Augusti, that's the plural form of Augustus, and then 2 junior emperors known as Caesares, or Caesars, were the junior emperors. And in the West, the Western Augustus with his junior emperor, who will be successor to the Western Augustus. And of course, there will be an Eastern Augustus with his junior Caesar, who will be his successor to the Eastern Augustus. So hopefully that makes sense to you. So here's the map, the way it was drawn out. It was actually divided into 4 territories. And so you can see that in the purple, the light purple, this is where Diocletian is ruling as the Augustus. And he's really in charge of all of that light purple as well as the dark purple, but that section is being led by his junior leader, the Caesar Galerius. And then in the West, you've got Constantius, Maximus, yes. Maximian, there we go. Maximian, who is the Augustus for the, I don't know, what is that, salmon, orange, pink? I'm not sure what color that is. But Italy, North Africa, Spain, and he's in control of that territory. But his junior partner, his Caesar, is going to be Constantius, and he's got control of Gaul and Britain. So again, the orangish, pinkish area is in control of that, and the green area, but that green area is being led by his junior. And then again, Diocletian, as the Augustus in the east, is control of the light purple and the dark purple, but he's allowing that darker purple to be in controlled by his junior emperor, Galerius. So that's how it's divided up. So here's what Rome looks like in 293. Now, another very important figure is Constantine, and he will eventually become the Western emperor. He will serve earlier under Diocletian, and then his father happens to be the Western Augustus, the chief emperor in the West. And then what happens is when Constantine's dad, Constantius, dies, Constantius' army is going to declare Constantine to be the new Augustus. Now that's a problem because, as I just showed you, there is already somebody in place who is the junior Caesar for the Augustus, and he's supposed to be the one who's now in control. But this army, Constantine's army, decided to take it upon themselves to elect a new ruler, and it's Constantine. Well, this is going to be a problem. His title is going to be contested since he wasn't the junior emperor in the West, and he's going to have to fight for control of his throne. He will eventually unify the entire empire. He will become the sole ruler of a unified Rome. He will move the capital to Byzantium and change its name to New Rome. And eventually, in 330, it will be renamed Constantinople in his honor. So Constantine is a very important figure. Before he was about to undergo a significant battle, it's claimed that he had a vision, and he's going to see a Chi Rho. Chi is the Greek letter X, and Rho is the Greek letter R. These two letters are the first two letters in the name of Christ, and it was an early Christian symbol along with the cross. And he's going to see a vision of a Chi Rho and cross symbol. Here is a painting. I'm going to zoom in on there so you can see what that looks like. There's that Chi Rho, and here's what it looks like, a little bit more defined. It's kind of hard to see in that painting, but Chi, the X, and the Rho. So CHR, the first three letters in the name Christ. And he's also, as claims to have seen in the sky, or a vision, I should say, in the sky, a cross with the Greek words under it, in tautoi nika, which means in this sign, conquer. And he's going to interpret this to mean that God is on his side, and he promises to become a believer, a follower of Jesus if he has victory. And guess what? He ends up winning the battle. He does have victory. Let's see, we're going to move to the next slide here. Here we go. He will win the battle. He will convert to Christianity. Or does he? Honestly, we don't really know. Was it a real conversion or a fake conversion? We're not really sure, and it's really not for us to decide, but people have debated that for hundreds of years. He will eventually issue the Edict of Milan a few years later, in 313, and this allows Christianity to become a religio licita, or a legal religion. Prior to this, it was illegal. This was a result of Domitian's persecution of Christians a few decades earlier, but now Christianity becomes a legal religion. And eventually, under future Emperor Theodosius I in 379 to 395, Christianity will become the official state religion of the empire. Constantine will become very involved in Christianity. He believes it is key to the unity and success of his reign and the empire. And this is going to be a good thing in some regards, and a bad thing in some regards. It's a good thing that Christians aren't being persecuted. It's a good thing that they have the opportunity to make choices to be a Christ follower or not. But unfortunately, his involvement in the church is going to blur the lines between state and church. Let's take a look at this next slide here. So Constantine and the Council of Nicaea. An early controversy in Christianity was called Arianism. And this was a doctrinal controversy over whether or not Jesus was a god or just a man, or was he the God-man? And Arianism essentially denied the deity of Jesus. He was simply a man that God used. And this was a significant problem because this was a departure from what Christianity had taught from the very beginning, the first 300 years of its existence. So Constantine, because this is conflicting and causing a problem, disunity in his empire, he's going to call for a church council to settle the issue. This council will be called in Nicaea in 325. Constantine himself preside, and the church will eventually settle this conclusion or settle this controversy, and they will issue this decree that Jesus is indeed God. They establish the Nicene Creed as the church's official belief on the person of Christ. And in many churches today, they still recite and hold to the Nicene Creed, and that's a very significant church council. Now, what this did, in one hand, it was very good. This is the rise and the fall of the church. Because there was persecution of the church, that's bad. Support for Christianity by Constantine and his successors was a good thing in the sense that persecution went away. That's a positive thing. Unfortunately, the negative is this. Constantine set the precedent for state involvement in the affairs of the church. And in 330 AD, Emperor Theodosius will make Christianity a legal religion, become a state religion. This will set the stage for corruption or disruption of the church. Because what happens is Christianity becomes the official state religion, there becomes an incentive to, quote, become a Christian, whether you are or aren't. There's political advantage, there are financial gains to be made, and so conversions to Christianity for political or financial gain are going to be commonplace. And you can't really convert to Christianity if it's not something you're truly doing, if it's just something you're doing it in name only. And so, secondly, state influencing appointments of church leaders in theology. This is going to set the stage for the state appointing people in high prominent offices, bishop, pope, priest, etc., in the church. This is going to be a problem for the next 1,000 years, really, and also inserting themselves into theological debate and making decisions about what the church believes, all from people who may or may not even be Christians. So the result is some church officials are not Christians, and eventually we're going to have some non-biblical theology that is going to pervade in some places in Christianity. So this is a problem. So it's the rise and the fall of the church all at the same time. Now here's the last part we'll look at. This is the collapse of the Roman Empire. You need to know that there are two factors. There are internal factors as well as external. Let's look at a couple of the internal factors. There's economic problems, political disorder and corruption, as well as moral decay happening throughout the Roman Empire. There are, however, also some external factors, primarily invasions from Germanic or barbarian tribes from throughout Europe. The Visigoths will sack Rome in 410 AD. There's some paintings demonstrating the sacking of Rome. You're going to see the invasion of Attila the Hun of Italy in 452 AD. There's Attila. You'll even have, and this painting here shows Pope Leo I is going to be sent as an emissary by Emperor Valentinian III to negotiate peace, and he is successful. Attila is quite persuaded by Attila to discontinue his invasion of Italy, and the Pope essentially saves Rome. Finally, you're going to see the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustus, is going to be deposed by the Germanic warlord Augustus in 476 AD. And isn't it interesting? The first king, the first leader of Rome is Romulus, and the last emperor is Romulus Augustus. And this basically brings an end to the Roman Empire in 476. Here are some classical paintings and drawings of Augustus forcing the abdication of Caesar Romulus Augustus in 476. And here is a map showing you where these invasions took place and where they went to. You had in the north Angles, Saxons, and Jutes coming from Denmark and Norway into northern Europe as well as Britain. You're going to see the Vandals invade down into southeast Europe, but throughout Western Europe, into North Africa, and then throughout the Mediterranean world and the different islands. You're going to see the spread of the Goths. You're going to see the spread of the Huns. Attila the Hun, he's going to make his capital there, and you're going to see he's going to attack and spread throughout Europe and southeast Europe. Then you've got the Ostrogoths that are going to go into the Italian peninsula and control there. You've got the Visigoths that will also invade in Italy, but also into Spain and partially into North Africa. And then finally we've got the Franks, a Germanic tribe that will move west across Germany and France. They will be a significant tribe that you're going to want to keep them in mind, the Franks. So this is the invasions, essentially this movement of people that takes place over the course of about 400 years, but most significantly in the 5th century from about 400 to 500 AD. And when the dust settles, this is what it looks like. The West has collapsed, the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire continues as the Byzantine Empire, and as I said earlier, for another 1,000 years. And then you've got these different tribes that have settled and established themselves. The Ostrogoths in Southeast Europe, partially, and in Europe, I should say the Italian Peninsula. You've got the Franks there in Central Europe, the Jutes, Angles, and Saxons in Britain, the Visigoths over there in Spain and part of the Bordeaux region of France. You've got the Vandals in North Africa and in the Mediterranean. So this is how the empire looks at the end of the 5th century. Okay, so what is the legacy of the Roman Empire? This is something that's been debated for hundreds of years. Was it a good thing or a bad thing? And the truth is, it's yes and no. The Roman Empire left us a lot of great things and a lot of baggage as well. A lot of innovations in political arenas, science, a lot of inventions and innovations in a lot of different areas. Roads and aqueducts, arches, dome construction, bathhouses, a lot of monumental architecture, glass windows, concrete. All of these were significant contributions to civilization. At the same time, there was the imperial impulse, which we would all probably agree is not necessarily a good thing. Warfare. Rome, if anything, was known for its warfare and its conquering different people groups, and that is obviously not a great thing, certainly not the way we do things today. So there were some good things and some bad things. Whether or not it was a good thing for Rome to help Christianity or along the way inserting it into the religious affairs of Christianity, I think overall we could say is probably a negative thing. As we will see in the next couple of chapters and the things that unfolded as a result of that. Obviously a great thing that Christians were no longer persecuted, but intertwining state and religion is probably never a good thing. So a lot of great things and some questionable things that happened during the time of the Roman Empire, but this is nonetheless the legacy of the Roman Empire.